They were the ultimate power couple of Europe, for centuries ruling an empire so vast the sun literally never set on it, from dusty Castilian plains to the bustling ports of the Netherlands, from the snowy peaks of Austria to the vibrant markets of Naples. The Habsburg family name was carved onto every royal decree. Their story was one of incredible ambition, strategic marriages and jaw-dropping wealth, but beneath the glittering crowns and grand palaces, a secret terror constantly gnawed at the heart of their dynasty. Who would rule next? This wasn't just a simple question of line of succession. This was a recurring nightmare that plunged continents into brutal wars, shattered alliances and reshaped maps. 5 times the very survival of their incredible legacy hung by a thread caught in the terrifying vortex of a succession crisis. Number 5. The War of the Spanish Succession. The air inside the Alcazar of Madrid in the late 17th century felt heavy, thick with the scent of illness and the unspoken dread of an entire continent. King Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburg line, was dying. He had been dying for years, perhaps even from birth. His face, pale and drawn, bore the unmistakable marks of generations of close family marriages. His jaw protruded dramatically, making it almost impossible for him to chew properly or even speak clearly. He was frail, often sick, and crucially had no children. The fate of an empire that stretched from Europe to the Americas. An empire still vast and rich despite its decline, rested on his failing breath. For decades, the great powers of Europe had watched Charles with a morbid fascination, like vultures circling a sick animal. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, had a direct claim through his wife Maria Theresa, Charles's half-sister. Emperor Leopold I, the head of the Austrian Habsburgs, had his own equally strong claim through his mother Maria Anna, also Charles's aunt, and through his first wife Margaret Theresa, Charles's full sister. It was a tangled web of family ties, all pointing back to the same sick man in Madrid. The problem was, if either the French Bourbons or the Austrian Habsburgs inherited the entire Spanish Empire, the balance of power in Europe would shatter. One family would become too dominant, a terrifying prospect for everyone else. Years before Charles's final decline, frantic diplomatic efforts had tried to prevent the inevitable conflict. Secret treaties were drawn up proposing to partition the Spanish Empire, slicing it up like a grand cake to satisfy all appetites and prevent a continent-wide war. The first partition treaty in 1698 suggested that Joseph Ferdinand, the young Bavarian Prince-Elector, would get the bulk of Spain's territories, while France and Austria would get smaller pieces. This seemed like a reasonable compromise. But then, in February 1699, the young Prince Joseph Ferdinand, a child barely 7 years old, suddenly died. His unexpected death sent shockwaves through the courts of Europe, proving just how fragile these carefully constructed plans could be. The game was reset. A second partition treaty emerged in 1700. This time, it proposed that Archduke Charles Leopold I's younger son would inherit most of the Spanish lands. France, in turn, would receive territories in Italy. It was a delicate dance, a desperate attempt to thread the needle of peace. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to avoid a war, but no one wanted to give up their claims entirely. All this time, Charles II lingered. He knew the pressure, the constant whispers, the secret negotiations happening behind his back. He had tried to choose an heir, at times leaning towards his Austrian relatives, at others influenced by the powerful pro-French faction at his court, led by his own queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg. The queen, incidentally, was a German princess, but she despised her Habsburg in-laws and championed the French cause. Charles was a deeply religious man, haunted by the thought of his soul's salvation and the fate of his vast realm. He consulted theologians, advisors, and even sought advice from the Pope. His last will, the document that would decide the fate of a continent, was drawn up in secret in October 1700. The moment finally arrived. King Charles II, frail beyond imagining, his mind clouded by years of illness and the weight of his impossible inheritance, signed his final will. He breathed his last on November 1st, 1700. a day of profound silence across the empire. The contents of his will, when finally revealed, sent a gasp through every European court. He had named Philip, Duke of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, as his sole heir. The entire undivided Spanish Empire from Madrid to Manila, from Antwerp to Peru, was bequeathed to a Bourbon prince. The will also included a crucial condition. Philip must renounce all claim to the French throne. This was meant to prevent the unthinkable, the union of the French and Spanish crowns. When the news reached Versailles, Louis XIV faced the biggest decision of his life. He had spent years negotiating partition treaties, promising to divide the Spanish inheritance. Now the whole thing was being offered to his family on a silver platter. His advisors were divided. Some urged caution, warning that accepting the will meant certain war. Others, seeing the immense prestige and power, pushed him to accept. After much deliberation, famously declaring, "There are no Pyrenees anymore," a dramatic statement signifying the end of the traditional geographical and political barrier, decayed. The 14th accepted the will. Philip of Anjou became Philip V of Spain. The reaction across Europe was swift and furious. The reaction. Emperor Leopold I, the Austrian Habsburg, felt utterly betrayed. He had been promised a significant part of the Spanish inheritance in the partition treaties, and now his family received nothing. He refused to recognize Philip V. In England, King William III, a fierce opponent of French dominance, recognized the immediate threat. A Bourbon on the Spanish throne, potentially united with France, meant France would be too powerful, threatening the very foundations of European liberty and trade. The Grand Alliance, consisting of the Holy Roman Empire, England, and the Dutch Republic, quickly formed. Their goal was clear: prevent the union of the French and Spanish crowns, secure a fair share of the Spanish inheritance for the Austrian Habsburgs, and restore the balance of power. Officially began in 1701. It was not just a war, it was a continental inferno, dragging almost every major European power into its destructive embrace. It was fought on land and sea in grand sieges and sprawling battles from the fields of Bavaria to the deserts of New Mexico. The main theaters of war were the Spanish, Netherlands, Germany, and Italy, but it also raged in Spain, itself dividing the country into factions and across the vast colonial empires. On one side stood the formidable military machine of France and Spain, led by legendary French generals like Villars and Vendôme. On the other, the Grand Alliance, commanded by two military geniuses, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, the English general, and Prince Eugene of Savoy, the brilliant commander of the Holy Roman Empires. The early years of the war saw France and its allies gain significant ground. But then in 1704, Marlborough and Eugene orchestrated a daring and audacious march. Marlborough, having convinced the Dutch to let him move his Anglo-Dutch forces eastward, linked up with Eugene in Bavaria. On August 13, 1704, their combined armies clashed with the Franco-Bavarian forces at the Battle of Blenheim. It was a decisive victory for the Grand Alliance, shattering the myth of French invincibility and forcing France to pull its forces back. From the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, the victory saved Vienna, the Habsburg capital, from direct threat. Blenheim was just the beginning. In the following years, Marlborough continued his string of triumphs. In 1706, he won another crushing victory at Ramillies, clearing the French out of almost all of the Spanish Netherlands. That same year, Prince Eugene, operating in Italy, secured a victory at Turin, driving French forces out of northern Italy. The Grand Alliance seemed unstoppable. Their armies pushed deep into French territory, threatening even Paris. Spain itself became a battleground, with Archduke Charles, the Austrian claimant, landing on the Iberian Peninsula and being proclaimed King Charles III by his supporters. Particularly in Catalonia, the conflict in Spain became a brutal civil war, adding another layer of misery to the already devastating conflict. But wars are not always won by single blows. France, though bruised, was not broken. Louis XIV, despite his age and the mounting casualties, refused to give up. The war dragged on, becoming a grinding war of attrition. The costs, both human and financial, were immense. Battles like Malplaquet in 1709 were tactical victories for the alliance, but at such a horrific cost in lives that even Marlborough recoiled from the slaughter. The public in England grew weary of the endless fighting and the rising taxes. Political shifts occurred in London, leading to the Tories, who favored peace. Gaining power, meanwhile, a new twist of fate arrived for the Habsburgs. In 1711, Emperor Joseph I Leopold I's elder son and the reigning Holy Roman Emperor suddenly died of smallpox. This meant that his younger brother, Archduke Charles, the very same Charles who was fighting for the Spanish throne, now became Emperor Charles VI of the Holy Roman Empire. This turn of events completely altered the diplomatic landscape. The Grand Alliance had gone to war to prevent the union of the French and Spanish crowns. Now they faced the equally alarming prospect of the union of the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg crowns, recreating the vast empire of Charles V. This was precisely what everyone had feared from the beginning. With this new reality, the appetite for peace intensified. Negotiations began in earnest at the Dutch city of Utrecht in 1712. After long, complex, and often acrimonious discussions, a series of treaties were signed in 1713 and 1714, collectively known as the Peace of Utrecht. Philip V was recognized as King of Spain and the Spanish Indies, but crucially, he was forced to formally renounce all claims to the French throne, ensuring the separation of the two crowns. The Habsburgs, under Emperor Charles VI, received the Spanish Netherlands, the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Sicily, and the Duchy of Milan. England gained Gibraltar and Minorca, securing vital naval bases, and also benefited from trade concessions. The War of the Spanish Succession, born from the dying breath of one king, had lasted for 13 years. It reshaped the map of Europe, cemented the concept of the balance of power, and left millions dead. It put a Bourbon on the throne of Spain, ending the long reign of the Spanish Habsburgs, but it also significantly expanded the European territories of the Austrian Habsburgs, setting the stage for their own future struggles. The next time a Habsburg monarch faced a succession crisis, the lessons of this devastating conflict would weigh heavily on everyone's minds. The fragile peace that now settled over Europe was just a temporary pause, a deep breath before the next inevitable storm. Number 4. The War of the Austrian Succession. The clock had been ticking for decades for Emperor Charles VI, ever since his brother, Emperor Joseph I, had unexpectedly died in 1711. Leaving Charles as the sole male Habsburg heir. Charles had lived with a profound and constant anxiety. His only surviving children were daughters, and the ancient laws of the Holy Roman Empire, along with the traditions of the Habsburg lands, generally favored male succession. The memory of the devastating War of the Spanish Succession, which had just concluded and cost millions of lives, haunted him. He was determined to avoid a repeat, determined to ensure his beloved daughter Maria Theresa would inherit all of his vast, sprawling domains without challenge. So in 1713, Charles VI issued a landmark decree known as the Pragmatic Sanction. This wasn't a secret document. It was a grand declaration, a legal instrument meant to guarantee the indivisibility of the Habsburg territories and the right of succession through his female line, if he had no male heirs. It specifically named Maria Theresa as his primary successor. Charles dedicated the rest of his life to getting every single European power to agree to this document, to sign off on it, to recognize it as binding. He spent huge sums of money, made countless diplomatic concessions, and even sacrificed valuable territories to win their acceptance. He gave away parts of the Habsburg lands in Italy. He made trade agreements that were not in his favor, all to get a signature on a piece of paper. He believed that if he had enough promises from enough powerful kings and princes, his daughter's future would be secure. He collected signatures like a meticulous stamp collector, convinced that paper promises would be enough to hold back the tide of ambition. Years passed. Maria Theresa grew into a formidable young woman, intelligent, determined, and deeply devoted to her family and her duty. She married Francis Stephen of Lorraine, a charming and ambitious prince. They began to have children, ensuring the continuation of the Habsburg line, though still no sons were born to Charles. Charles VI, though relieved by his daughter's strong character, never stopped worrying. He had received promises from Prussia, Saxony, Bavaria, France, Spain, Great Britain, and the Dutch Republic. He believed he had done everything humanly possible to ensure a peaceful transition. Then, on October 20th, 1740, Emperor Charles VI suddenly died. He had gone hunting, caught a chill, and succumbed rapidly the moment he had dreaded for so long had arrived. Maria Theresa, a young woman of 23, was now the Archduchess of Austria, Queen of Bohemia, Queen of Hungary, and ruler of a host of other lands. She stepped into her father's shoes, grieving, but resolute. But the ink on those many treaties, the very agreements her father had so painstakingly collected, was barely dry before they were challenged. The promises meant nothing. The moment Charles VI's eyes closed, the vultures began to circle once more. The first to strike was King Frederick II of Prussia, later known as Frederick the Great. He was a young, ambitious, and utterly ruthless monarch, who had only been on his throne for a few months. He saw an opportunity in Maria Theresa's youth, and her perceived weakness as a female ruler. In December 1740, just weeks after Charles VI's death, Frederick marched his army into Silesia, a rich and fertile province belonging to the Habsburgs. His claim was flimsy, based on some ancient, obscure rights that most historians agree were simply an excuse for conquest. This act of aggression, a complete betrayal of his earlier promise to uphold the Pragmatic Sanction, ignited the War of the Austrian Succession. Frederick's invasion was the signal for others. Charles Albert, the Elector of Bavaria, put forward his own claim to the Habsburg lands, arguing that he had a stronger claim through an old family agreement. He was swiftly backed by France, who saw an opportunity to weaken their old Habsburg rivals. Spain, still smarting from the loss of its Italian territories in the previous war, joined the fray, hoping to reclaim them for its Bourbon monarch Philip V. Saxony and Sardinia also joined the anti-Habsburg coalition at various points. Maria Theresa found herself surrounded by enemies almost alone. Her treasury was depleted from her father's diplomatic spending, her army was scattered and in disarray. Vienna itself seemed vulnerable. She had to fight for every inch of her inheritance. Her determination in the face of such overwhelming odds became legendary. She famously traveled to Hungary in 1741, pleading with the Hungarian nobility for their support. She presented herself before them, clad in traditional Hungarian attire, and with tears in her eyes, addressed them in Latin, the traditional language of their parliament. She held her infant son Joseph in her arms, appealing to their honor and loyalty. The Hungarian nobles, moved by her courage and vulnerability, drew their swords and famously declared, "Moriamur pro re nostro Maria Theresa." Let us die for our King Maria Theresa. It was a powerful moment that rallied crucial support to her cause. The war raged across Europe for 8 long years. Maria Theresa learned quickly. She reorganized her army, appointed new generals, and made tough decisions. She had to make alliances of her own. Great Britain, ever mindful of the balance of power and its rivalry with France, eventually came to her aid, providing financial subsidies and sending troops. The Dutch Republic also offered support. The war was a kaleidoscope of shifting alliances and brutal battles. In the early years, the situation looked dire for Maria Theresa. French and Bavarian forces, led by the ambitious Elector Charles Albert, actually marched into Bohemia and took Prague. Charles Albert was even elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1742, becoming Emperor Charles VII. This was a massive blow to Habsburg prestige, as the imperial title had been held by her family almost continuously for centuries. However, his reign was short and troubled, marked by constant conflict and the occupation of his own lands by Austrian forces. He died in 1745, and the imperial title returned to the Habsburg family when Maria Theresa's husband, Francis Stephen, was elected emperor. Battles were fought in Flanders, Bohemia, Italy, and at sea. The Battle of Fontenoy in 1745 saw a major French victory over the British and their allies in the Austrian Netherlands. But Austrian forces under generals like Prince Charles of Lorraine and Marshal Daun fought tenaciously, often regaining lost ground. Frederick the Great continued to be a thorn in Maria Theresa's side, defeating her forces in Silesia and keeping that vital province firmly in his grasp. Despite her best efforts, Maria Theresa could never reclaim Silesia from Frederick. It would remain a bitter loss. The war finally wound down in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. The treaty largely confirmed Maria Theresa's succession to the Habsburg hereditary lands, upholding the Pragmatic Sanction. Her husband, Francis Stephen, was confirmed as Holy Roman Emperor. The Bourbon powers were largely checked, however. There were significant concessions. The Habsburgs lost Silesia to Prussia, a blow that Maria Theresa never truly accepted, and which would fuel the next major European conflict, the 7 Years' War. They also made some territorial adjustments in Italy to satisfy Spain and Sardinia. The War of the Austrian Succession was a direct test of the Pragmatic Sanction and Maria Theresa's right to rule. She had emerged from the fire-tempered and stronger, solidifying her position as one of Europe's most capable monarchs. She had fought fiercely for her inheritance and won the recognition she deserved, but at a huge cost. In lives and a crucial loss of territory, the crisis had confirmed that a piece of paper, no matter how many signatures it bore, was no match for ambition and military might when a throne stood empty. The Habsburgs had survived, but the brutal lessons of succession struggles continued to shape their destiny. Number 3. The crisis leading to the 30 Years' War. In the early 17th century, the Habsburg family ruled a vast and complicated set of lands from Austria itself to the crowns of Bohemia and Hungary, and of course held the ancient, prestigious title of Holy Roman Emperor. But for decades, the family had been grappling with a deeply unsettling internal crisis centered around their eccentric and increasingly unstable emperor, Rudolf II. This wasn't a sudden death and a grab for power. This was a slow, agonizing unraveling, a festering wound within the family that would eventually burst open, dragging all of Europe into the most devastating conflict it had ever seen. Rudolf II was a peculiar man, more interested in alchemy, astronomy, art, and strange, arcane studies than in the mundane business of ruling. He kept his court in Prague, largely isolating himself in his castle, surrounded by his collections of oddities and his advisors who dabbled in the occult. He rarely appeared in public, hated state ceremonies, and preferred the quiet solitude of his laboratories and art galleries. He was a brilliant patron of the arts, but a terrible emperor. His melancholic temperament grew darker, his decision-making became erratic, and his suspicious nature alienated even his closest relatives. He had no children, and crucially no clear heir. The clock was ticking, and the very real problem of his succession loomed large over the dynasty. His brothers particularly, Matthias watched with increasing alarm. Matthias was a pragmatic, ambitious man, almost the polar opposite of Rudolf. He believed Rudolf was not only incapable of ruling, but was actively endangering the Habsburg legacy by his inaction and strange behavior. The situation in the Holy Roman Empire was already tense, with deep divisions between Protestants and Catholics, simmering resentments among the princes, and a growing desire for greater autonomy. Rudolf's inability to provide strong leadership only made things worse. By the turn of the century, the fraternal strife was in full swing. Matthias, with the backing of other Habsburg brothers and frustrated Catholic princes, began to openly challenge Rudolf's authority. It was a humiliating spectacle for the ruling dynasty. In 1606, the brothers met and essentially forced Rudolf to recognize Matthias as the head of the family and future successor to the Habsburg hereditary lands. This was a huge step, effectively stripping Rudolf of his real power, though he clung to the imperial title. Matthias, eager to consolidate his gains, then marched into Bohemia in 1608 with an army. Rudolf, cornered and with no real support, was forced to cede the rule of Hungary, Austria, and Moravia to Matthias. Rudolf held on to Bohemia and the imperial crown, but his authority was crumbling. In Bohemia, to gain support against his brother, Rudolf made a critical concession. He issued the Letter of Majesty in 1609, granting considerable religious freedom to Bohemian Protestants. This was a stark contrast to the aggressive counter-Reformation policies favored by other Habsburgs, particularly Rudolf, still clinging to power in Bohemia, tried to regain some of his lost authority, even attempting to raise an army. This only further inflamed tensions. Matthias, consolidating his power, began to make preparations for his own election as emperor. Finally, in 1611, Matthias invaded Bohemia. Again, Rudolf was forced to abdicate the Bohemian throne. A year later, in 1612, Rudolf II died, a lonely, broken man, his vast art collection scattering as his power evaporated. Matthias then formally became Holy Roman Emperor. Matthias was now emperor and held most of the Habsburg lands, but he too faced a succession problem. He was old, and he also had no children. The family had already decided on their next heir, Ferdinand of Styria, Matthias's cousin. Ferdinand was a devout Catholic, educated by Jesuits, and a fierce advocate for the Counter-Reformation. He had already suppressed Protestantism in his own lands of Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola. With a heavy hand, his selection as the presumptive heir sent shivers down the spines of Protestants across the Holy Roman Empire, especially in Bohemia, where Rudolf's Letter of Majesty had promised them religious freedom. Matthias, despite his earlier concessions, began to push for Ferdinand's acceptance as King of Bohemia and Hungary while he was still alive. This was a move meant to ensure a smooth transition, but it backfired spectacularly. In 1617, Ferdinand was indeed crowned King of Bohemia. He immediately began to revoke some of the religious freedoms granted by Rudolf. He took control of Protestant churches, prevented the building of new ones, and appointed staunch Catholics to key positions. The Bohemian Protestants, who had enjoyed a long tradition of religious independence, felt their rights were being systematically eroded. They remembered the Letter of Majesty, the solemn promise of their former king. The tension reached a boiling point in May 1618. A group of angry Protestant nobles marched to the Hradčany castle in Prague. They confronted two imperial regents, Count Vilém Slavata and Jaroslav Borzita of Martinez, and their secretary Philip Fabricius. A heated argument. The Bohemian nobles, fueled by outrage and a sense of betrayal, found the Habsburg representatives guilty of violating their liberties. In a dramatic act of defiance, they seized the three men and threw them out of a window 70 feet down into the castle moat. Miraculously, all three survived, landing in a pile of dung. This event, known as the Second Defenestration of Prague, was not an isolated act of violence. It was a deliberate, symbolic act of rebellion against Habsburg authority and a direct challenge to Ferdinand's right. To Tamanant Ferdinand, the Defenestration of Prague ignited the Bohemian revolt. The Bohemian estates deposed Ferdinand as their king, and in 1619 elected Frederick V, the devoutly Calvinist, Elector Palatine, as their new monarch. He was known as the Winter King because his reign was so short. Ferdinand, meanwhile, became Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II upon Matthias's death in 1619. He was now faced with a direct challenge to his rule and a Protestant rebellion in one of his most important kingdoms. He was not a man to compromise. Ferdinand II, with the support of a Catholic League and the Spanish Habsburgs, moved swiftly to crush the Bohemian revolt. In November 1620, his forces, led by General Tilly, decisively defeated the Bohemian army at the Battle of White Mountain just outside Prague. The battle was short and brutal, ending the Bohemian uprising and ushering in a period of harsh repression. Frederick V fled into exile. The Letter of Majesty was publicly torn up. Protestantism was suppressed in Bohemia, its leaders executed or exiled, and vast estates confiscated and redistributed to Catholic nobles loyal to Ferdinand. This was not just the end of a rebellion. The Bohemian Revolt and Ferdinand II's forceful response escalated into a far wider European conflict. Other German princes, both Protestant and Catholic, were drawn in, fearing either Habsburg domination or the spread of religious radicalism. Soon, Denmark, Sweden, and France, all with their own political and religious agendas, joined the fray. The limited succession crisis within the Habsburg family had metastasized into the 30 Years' War, a devastating conflict that would rage across Central Europe for 3 decades, causing unimaginable death and destruction, and fundamentally altering the political and religious landscape of the continent. The inability of Rudolf II to govern, the ambition of Matthias, and the uncompromising zeal of Ferdinand II had all contributed to this catastrophe, turning a fatalism for millions. The succession had been secured for Ferdinand, but at a price that almost tore Europe apart. Number 2. The imperial election of 1519. The news of Emperor Maximilian I's death in January 1519 sent immediate shockwaves across Europe. Maximilian was a Habsburg, a master of dynastic marriages, and a shrewd if somewhat financially irresponsible ruler. His death meant that the most prestigious and powerful secular title in Christendom, that of Holy Roman Emperor, was now vacant. This was not a hereditary position that simply passed down. It was an elected office decided by 7 powerful German princes, known as electors. And the choice of the next emperor would shape the destiny of Europe for centuries. This was a succession crisis of immense political and strategic proportions, a high-stakes game of influence, bribery, and cunning diplomacy. 3 young, ambitious, and incredibly powerful monarchs immediately threw their hats into the ring. Each believed they had the best claim, or at least the best chance, to win the coveted imperial crown. First, there was Charles I, King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy, and ruler of vast lands in the Netherlands and Italy, not to mention the burgeoning Spanish Empire in the Americas. He was Maximilian's grandson, and thus the logical Habsburg candidate. He was only 19 years old, but he already commanded immense wealth and territory. His claim was based on the tradition of Habsburg emperors, and his incredible power made him a formidable contender. Next was Francis I, King of France. He was a flamboyant, matic, and militarily successful monarch who had already made his mark on Europe. He saw the imperial title as a way to enhance France's prestige and to prevent the Habsburgs from completely encircling his kingdom. He was a relative newcomer to the imperial race, but he had a powerful army and a deep treasury. And, finally, there was Henry VIII, King of England. While a long-shot, Henry was an ambitious and confident king who believed he could play a significant role on the European stage. He put forward his own candidacy, perhaps more for diplomatic leverage and prestige than with any real expectation of winning. But it added another layer of intrigue to the contest. The 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire were the Prince Archbishop of Trier, the Prince Archbishop of Cologne, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. Their votes were the key. And those votes were for sale. This was a grand-scale auction, where the candidates poured vast sums of money, promises of titles, and strategic alliances into bribing the electors. The competition between Charles and Francis was particularly intense. Francis launched a massive propaganda campaign, sending agents across Germany to argue his case. He promised religious reforms and protection against the growing Ottoman threat in the East. Knowing that the German princes feared both, he claimed that a German emperor would be too weak to protect the empire, effectively implying that only a powerful foreign king like himself could truly lead. He offered cash, a lot of cash, to the electors. Charles, for his part, had the advantage of being Maximilian's grandson and thus represented the continuity of the Habsburg dynasty, which had held the imperial title for generations. He also had the support of the powerful Fugger banking family. Jacob Fugger, a German merchant, was arguably the richest man in Europe. He lent enormous sums of money to Charles, which Charles then used to outbid Francis. It was a staggering amount of money, an early example of how finance could directly influence high politics. Fugger's ledgers meticulously recorded the payments to the electors. detailing how each one received significant sums to cast their vote for Charles. The electors themselves played a cynical game. They wanted to extract as much as possible from both candidates. They pretended to lean one way, then another, driving up the price. Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, was particularly shrewd. He received large sums from both Charles and Francis, and for a time even considered running himself. He initially offered the crown to Charles, but then hesitated, making Charles nervous. Each elector was a sovereign in his own right, and the imperial election was a rare opportunity to assert their power and enrich themselves. The Pope, Leo X, also played a complex role. He initially favored Francis, fearing Charles's immense power. A Charles as emperor already ruling Spain and the vast Burgundian lands would completely encircle the Papal States and threaten papal independence. However, the Pope later shifted his stance, fearing Francis's ambition even more, and eventually gave his tacit support to Charles, though he never openly endorsed either. The negotiations were not just about money, they were about promises. Promises of military aid, promises of respect for the elector's individual rights, promises of protecting the empire from its enemies, particularly the Ottoman Turks, who were an ever-present threat on Europe's eastern flank. Both Charles and Francis presented themselves as the true champions of Christendom, capable of leading a crusade against the Ottomans. In the end, Charles's combination of tradition, overwhelming financial muscle, and his promise to respect the rights of the German princes proved decisive. The electors, perhaps wary of electing a powerful French king who might try to centralize power at their expense, and certainly swayed by the enormous sums of money, made their choice. On June 28, 1519, at Frankfurt, Charles I of Spain was unanimously elected Holy Roman Emperor. He became Emperor Charles V. The news was met with jubilation in Spain and the Habsburg lands, and bitter disappointment in France. Francis I felt betrayed and humiliated, a feeling that would fuel decades of rivalry and war between him and Charles. Charles V's election created a super empire, combining the vast Spanish possessions with the traditional Habsburg lands and the nominal leadership of the Holy Roman Empire. It was an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, from the Low Countries to the New World. It immediately ignited fears of a universal monarchy, a single power dominating all of Europe. This fear, along with Francis I's burning resentment, directly led to the long and brutal Habsburg-Valois Wars, a series of conflicts that consumed Europe for the next 25 years. The election of 1519 was not a war of succession in itself, but it was a profound crisis that launched an era of unprecedented conflict. The Habsburgs had won the imperial crown, but the price was a continent plunged into continuous warfare. The ramifications of this single election would echo through European history for centuries, shaping the political map and the very balance of power. Number 1. The acquisition of Bohemia and Hungary. The year is 1526, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the plain of Mohacs in southern Hungary. King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, a young man of only 20 years, stood on the battlefield surrounded by his vastly outnumbered army. Facing him was the overwhelming force of the Ottoman Empire led by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, a ruler whose ambition matched his military genius. The fate of two kingdoms, and indeed the very future of Central Europe, rested on this single brutal clash. Louis was a Jagiellon king, a member of a prominent Central European dynasty. But his marriage to Mary of Austria, a Habsburg princess, had tied his fate to the powerful Habsburg family. The battle itself was swift and devastating. On August 29, 1526, the Ottoman army, with its superior artillery and disciplined Janissary infantry, utterly routed the Hungarian forces. The Hungarian cavalry, brave but ill-coordinated, was cut down. King Louis II, attempting to flee the carnage, fell from his horse into a swampy stream, weighed down by his heavy armor, and drowned. His death was sudden and unexpected, a tragic end to a short life, and it created an immediate, profound power vacuum. The crowns of Bohemia and Hungary, two vitally important kingdoms, were now leaderless. This wasn't just a political crisis, it was an existential one. The Ottomans, after their crushing victory, swept through Hungary, taking its capital, Buda. The very heart of Europe seemed open to invasion. The loss of Louis II meant not just the death of a king, but the end of the Jagiellon male line in those kingdoms. This opened the door wide for new claimants, and at the front of the line, armed with treaties and family ties, was Ferdinand of Austria, the younger brother of the newly elected Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Ferdinand's claim was strong, based on strategic dynastic marriages, orchestrated years before by his grandfather, Emperor Maximilian I. In 1515, a famous double-wedding agreement had been struck in Vienna. Louis II had married Mary of Austria, Ferdinand's sister. In return, Ferdinand had married Louis's sister, Anna Jagiellon. This agreement included a crucial succession clause. If either the Jagiellon or Habsburg lines in Bohemia and Hungary died out, the crowns would pass to the surviving spouse and their heirs. Louis's death at Mohacs made Anna Jagiellon, Ferdinand's wife, the key to the succession. Through her, Ferdinand claimed the right to the crowns of Bohemia and Hungary. However, a claim, even a strong one, was not the same as outright possession. Hungary was a notoriously unruly kingdom, with powerful nobles who fiercely guarded their ancient rights and privileges. They were not simply going to hand over their crown to a foreign prince, even one with a legal claim. A powerful Hungarian magnate, John Zápolya, the voivode of Transylvania, quickly put forward his own claim to the Hungarian throne. He was a wealthy and influential noble with considerable military backing from the Ottoman Sultan, who saw him as a useful vassal. Zápolya was elected King of Hungary by a faction of the Hungarian nobility. So, immediately after Louis's death, Hungary found itself with two kings, Ferdinand of Austria, claiming by right of marriage and treaty, and John Zápolya, claiming by election and popular noble support. This set the stage for a long and brutal civil war within Hungary, complicated by constant Ottoman interference. The struggle for Hungary became a three-way fight between the Habsburgs, John Zápolya, and the Ottoman Empire, who saw the chaos as an opportunity to expand their own power into Central Europe. Bohemia, on the other hand, while the Bohemian nobility also guarded their traditional rights, they were more accustomed to elected foreign rulers. Ferdinand's claim through his wife, Anna, was also strong there. After some negotiation and a relatively smoother process compared to Hungary, Ferdinand was elected King of Bohemia on October 23, 1526, and crowned in Prague in February 1527. This was a significant victory for the Habsburgs, securing a vital kingdom and adding it permanently to their hereditary lands. Bohemia would remain a core part of the Habsburg monarchy for centuries, but Hungary was a much tougher nut to crack. The civil war between Ferdinand and Zápolya raged on. Ferdinand's armies invaded Hungary, clashing with Zápolya's forces. Zápolya, in turn, sought deeper assistance from Suleiman the Magnificent. This brought the full might of the Ottoman Empire back into the heart of Europe. In 1529, Suleiman himself led a massive Ottoman army that marched through Hungary, besieged Vienna, Ferdinand's capital, and only retreated after a long, difficult, and ultimately unsuccessful siege. This massive Ottoman invasion showed just how perilous the situation was for the Habsburgs. And for Christendom as a whole, the struggle for Hungary dragged on for years. Both Ferdinand and Zápolya were eventually forced to make concessions to the Ottomans. A Habsburg ruled royal Hungary in the west and north. An Ottoman controlled central Hungary and Transylvania in the east, which remained under Zápolya's rule as an Ottoman vassal. The immediate crisis of succession had solidified Ottoman control over much of Hungary. It wasn't until John Zápolya's death in 1540 that Ferdinand finally secured a more comprehensive, though still contested, hold over the parts of Hungary not directly occupied by the Ottomans. Even then, the constant threat of Ottoman invasion and the ongoing struggle for control defined Hungarian politics. The Kingdom of Hungary effectively became a frontier zone between the Habsburg and Ottoman empires, a battleground for centuries to come. The crisis ignited by Louis II's death at Mohacs was a watershed moment. It brought Bohemia and a significant portion of Hungary permanently into the Habsburg fold, fundamentally reshaping the geography and power of the dynasty. Ferdinand I, as he would become known, laid the foundation for the Austrian Habsburg monarchy, distinct from the Spanish Habsburgs of his brother Charles V. But this acquisition was not peaceful or swift. It was marked by devastating military defeat, bitter civil war, and the constant terrifying presence of the Ottoman Empire on Europe's doorstep. The succession crisis in Hungary, driven by the death of a king and the competing claims of a Habsburg prince and a powerful local magnate, directly led to centuries of conflict and redefined the eastern border of Christian Europe. The Habsburgs had gained 2 crowns, but they came with the heavy price of constant warfare and a divided kingdom.